Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
I want you to take a second and just picture the desk you sat at in third grade. Like, really picture it.
Oh, that's a vivid memory for most people.
Right. You can probably see the wood grain. I mean, maybe there were a few scratches or, that groove where someone pressed way too hard with a pencil.
Yeah, or all the doodles from the kid who sat there the year before you.
Exactly. Now, try to remember the exact sound of the school bell ringing and feel that sudden, that highly specific knot of anxiety in your stomach when the teacher handed out a timed test.
Face down, of course.
Right, face down, and they told you, absolutely do not flip it over until they said go.
It's a universally recognizable feeling, and it happens inside this very specific, highly manufactured environment that we rarely ever stop to actually analyze.
And when you add it all up, from kindergarten all the way through the end of high school, you spent roughly 12,000 hours of your early life inside that exact environment.
12,000 hours.
12,000. Yet, almost nobody stops to look at the walls of that room and ask, who actually built this? Like, why is it shaped this specific way? And what is it fundamentally doing to us?
Which is wild, because it might be one of the most remarkable blind spots in our modern society. We just sort of accept the architecture of schooling as a natural fact of life.
Like gravity or the weather.
Exactly. We assume it has just always been this way and, that it always will be. But the reality is that the institution you spent all those hours in is a highly engineered construct.
Built by people with agendas.
Yes, built over centuries by people with very specific agendas.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
Because our mission for this deep dive is to look at the history, the hidden architecture, and the actual mechanics of formal schooling.
Right.
We're going to figure out who designed this massive institution, what their true motives were, and whether this global machine is actually achieving its stated goals.
We're basically going to trace the evolution of an institution that we all just take for granted.
And we're covering a lot of ground today, right?
We are. We'll start with ancient philosophies and then examine how religious revolutions and the printing press completely altered human cognition.
Oh, I love that part.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And then we'll dissect the industrial factory models of the 19th century and follow that thread right up to today.
Right, up to the modern trillion-dollar student debt crisis, and even how schooling dictates the very words we are allowed to speak.
But before we can look at where school is going or even where it came from, we really need to separate two words that we constantly use interchangeably.
Education and schooling.
Exactly. Because if you blur those lines, the rest of this entire history just won't make sense.
Right. Because education feels like it's just the act of passing the torch of human knowledge. It's what you do when you show a child how to tie their shoes.
Or how to plant a seed.
Yeah, or how to tell a story. It's a universal human activity.
It is. If we define education broadly, like as the transmission of knowledge, skills, values, and culture from one generation to the next, then education has existed in literally every single society for which we have records.
Hunter-gatherers educated their kids.
Exactly. Ancient nomadic tribes educated their children. It is a fundamental biological and cultural process. But formal schooling is something entirely different.
It's totally different.
Schooling is a historically specific, relatively recent invention. It involves purpose-built institutions. Buildings, yes. And designated professionals called teachers. And it relies on a highly specific, standardized curriculum.
It makes me think of an analogy. Like, education is basically learning how to cook by standing in the kitchen next to your grandmother.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. You're just watching her. You're smelling all the ingredients. You're making mistakes.
You're tasting the sauce as it simmers.
Exactly. It's organic. It's embedded in your daily life. And you learn the why and the how simultaneously through just, direct experience. But schooling, on the other hand, is like being abruptly removed from your house and sent to a highly structured culinary academy.
Where things are very different.
Totally different. Suddenly, you have to wear a specific uniform. You are given these timed, written exams on, like, the history of carrots.
The history of carrots.
There's a strict grading rubric, and you aren't actually allowed to touch a stove or cook the soup until the syllabus dictates that it is officially Soup Week.
What's fascinating here is that the history of this culinary academy, the formal school, has a deeply dual nature.
How do you mean?
Well, on one hand, we absolutely cannot deny that formal schooling represents a genuinely transformative intellectual achievement.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, the systematic nature of schooling is exactly what allowed us to spread mass literacy and scientific thinking and, complex mathematical competence across vast populations.
Because a grandmother's kitchen can only teach so much.
Precisely. A grandmother's kitchen, metaphorically speaking, cannot teach millions of people the calculus required to land a rover on Mars.
Right. Or the epidemiology needed to cure a disease.
Exactly.
So I definitely don't want to paint schooling as some inherent evil here. The liberatory functions of school are profound. I mean, it gave people the cognitive tools to read contracts, to understand laws.
To invent technologies.
Yeah, to essentially break free from historical ignorance.
The liberatory power is very real. But simultaneously, we have to recognize that schooling has always functioned as an instrument for social control.
Always.
Always. From its very inception, it has been utilized for ideological imposition, for sorting human beings into predetermined social classes.
And even for suppressing certain kinds of knowledge.
Exactly. The institution has always served those control functions right alongside its liberatory functions.
They are just completely intertwined. I mean, you get the cognitive liberation of learning to read, but the institution also tells you exactly what you're allowed to read.
And how you are supposed to interpret it.
Right. And how you must sit quietly in a standardized chair while you do it.
So if we want an honest look at this institution, we have to hold both of those realities in view at the exact same time. And to understand why we built these structured, dual-natured environments, we have to examine the original blueprints.
Which means we're going back to ancient Greece and Rome?
Yes. That is where the intellectual architecture for those 12,000 hours was first drafted.
Okay, let's go to ancient Athens. Because this is where we run into this concept of payday, which, from what I understand, wasn't about getting a kid ready for a 9-to-5 job.
Not at all.
Or giving them, like, vocational training. It was entirely oriented around citizenship, right?
That's right. The goal of paideia was the formation of the ideal citizen. And we should note, specifically, the free male citizen.
All right, very exclusive.
Highly exclusive.
Okay.
But the idea was to form a citizen who would be capable of participating effectively in the political and public life of the polis, the city-state.
Because the Greeks understood that a democracy, or even an aristocracy, could only actually function if the people participating in it had been properly formed.
Exactly. But the curriculum they used for that formation seems incredibly alien to us today.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I know there was a massive emphasis on gymnastics, and not just as a side activity, like modern PE class where you play dodgeball.
Right. Gymnastics in the Greek sense encompassed broad physical excellence. It wasn't just about military readiness, though that was certainly a practical component given the constant warfare of that era.
But it went deeper than that.
Much deeper. The Greeks believed in this profound connection between the physical and the moral. Cultivating a strong, disciplined, beautiful body was seen as the outward reflection of cultivating inner virtue.
And a disciplined mind.
Exactly. You literally couldn't have one without the other.
And alongside the physical, there was music. But again, this wasn't just, learning to play the recorder in 4th grade. This was about character formation.
Yes. Music encompassed playing instruments like the lyre, but it also included poetry, drama, and dance. It was about aesthetic cultivation and internalizing the cultural narratives of the society.
Like the epics of Homer.
Precisely. By internalizing these rhythms and stories, the student was supposed to absorb the virtues of the heroes.
That is so interesting.
And only after this foundational physical and aesthetic training did they move into the deeper intellectual disciplines that thinkers like Plato would eventually systematize.
Which naturally brings us to Plato's Academy, founded around, 387 BCE?
Roughly, yeah.
It's often pointed to as the very first institution of higher education in the Western world. Though, physically, it wasn't a campus with a library and a student union.
No, it was basically a grove of olive trees outside the city walls.
Where people just gathered to argue and inquire.
The physical space was informal, sure, but the pedagogical ambition was staggering. The academy was dedicated to the pursuit of pure, abstract truth through dialectic reasoning.
Okay, let's pause on that term dialectic reasoning, because that is definitely not how we learn today. We learn by reading a textbook and taking a multiple choice test. So how did a student at Plato's Academy actually learn?
Dialectic reasoning is essentially a method of rigorous cooperative dialogue. It involves proposing a thesis, subjecting it to relentless questioning to expose its contradictions or weaknesses, and then refining the idea into something closer to the truth.
So you don't learn by just memorizing a fact handed down by an authority.
Not at all. You learn by entering into the arena of debate, testing your assumptions against someone else's, and mutually working your way toward a higher understanding.
That sounds incredibly liberating, but I want to push back on this romanticized view. We always hear about classical education.
Fun enough.
We always hear about the Greek philosophers as these ultimate champions of free thought. But when I read about Plato's actual vision for an educational system in his most famous work, The Republic, I mean, it doesn't sound like a free-flowing exchange of ideas for everyone.
It doesn't.
It sounds incredibly restrictive. He essentially outlines a system designed to sort people into a rigid caste system.
That is a crucial observation, and it points to a deeply illiberal tension right at the heart of Western educational philosophy.
So it's baked right in.
Right from the start. In The Republic, Plato is designing a utopian society, a perfectly just city. And to maintain justice, which he defines as everyone doing the exact job they are naturally suited for education, is the primary mechanism of control.
And he roots this in his concept of the tripartite soul, right?
Yes.
The idea that the human soul has three parts: appetite, spirit, and reason.
Exactly. And Plato believed that in different individuals, different parts of the soul are naturally dominant. Therefore, he absolutely did not believe that everyone should get the same education.
Right.
He envisioned a rigid, highly engineered hierarchy. The vast majority of people in whom the appetitive part of the soul dominates would be educated just enough to perform their labor.
So farming, shoemaking, trade.
Right, and to obey the laws.
So they do not get the deep philosophical training.
Not at all. Then you have a middle tier, the auxiliaries or soldiers, driven by spirit. They would receive rigorous physical and musical training to make them brave, loyal protectors of the state.
But the highest level.
The highest level of education, that deep dialectic pursuit of abstract truth, was intentionally reserved for a tiny, elite ruling class in whom reason was dominant.
The philosopher kings.
The philosopher kings.
So the very first comprehensive blueprint we have for systematic education is explicitly designed to put people into boxes based on their supposed nature.
Yes.
I mean, it's education as a tool to form you for a pre-existing social role, to keep the society stable. It is not education as a tool to help you discover who you want to be or to break out of your class.
It is the defining tension in educational philosophy. Are we educating children to liberate them, to maximize their individual potential regardless of where they start, or are we educating them to conform to the existing political and economic order?
And Plato's answer was unapologetically the latter.
Unapologetically. Social stability trumped individual self-actualization every time.
Wow. And as this classical foundation evolved, the Romans took it over. And they didn't just copy the Greeks, right? I mean, the Romans were much more pragmatic, much more focused on administration and law. How did they alter the DNA of this educational blueprint?
Well, the Romans institutionalized it. They created a more layered, formalized progression of schools. You had the ludus, or grammarian school, for basic literacy and literature.
Like elementary school?
Sort of, yes. Then, for older students, you had the school of the rhetor, which provided advanced training in public speaking, argumentation, and law. But the core purpose really shifted. Roman education was much more explicitly vocational than the Greek model.
But when you say vocational, you obviously don't mean training blacksmiths or carpenters.
No, the vocation was power. They were training people to be the orator. In the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, the ability to persuade a crowd, to argue brilliantly in the law courts, and to command the political assemblies was the ultimate concrete skill.
So their education system was heavily focused on producing men capable of dominating legal and political life.
Exactly. It was far less about Plato's disinterested pursuit of abstract truth and much more about the practical application of rhetoric to achieve very specific outcomes.
So they were training lawyers and politicians. I mean, some things really never change.
They really don't.
Now, when the Roman Empire eventually collapses, this Greco-Roman foundation doesn't just evaporate. it morphs, it gets preserved by the church, and it eventually crystallizes into the education system of the Middle Ages.
Yes, the medieval period.
And this is where we get the trivium and the quadrivium. Now, I've always heard these terms thrown around as the absolute pinnacle of classical education, but I want to understand how they actually work together to build a mind.
It's a brilliant system. The trivium and the quadrivium constituted the 7 liberal arts, and they are beautiful in their structural logic. They weren't just a random list of subjects you had to take.
Like a modern high school schedule.
Right. They were a sequential architecture for human thought. The trivium, which literally means the 3 ways, consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. These were the foundational arts of language and thought.
But grammar back then wasn't just, learning where to put a comma, right?
Not at all. Grammar was the foundational mechanics of reality. It was learning how to define things, how to name the components of the world, and understanding the deep structure of language itself.
Okay, that makes sense.
Once you had those building blocks of grammar, you moved to logic. Logic was the art of connecting those defined concepts. It taught you how to build a sound argument, how to identify a fallacy, how to deduce a truth from premises. You learn the internal mechanics of thought.
So grammar gives you the bricks, and logic shows you how to build the wall.
Perfect analogy. And then rhetoric.
Rhetoric is how you paint the wall and convince someone else to buy the house.
Exactly. It is the art of persuasion, of expressing those logical thoughts beautifully and compellingly to an audience. You master the thing itself, you master the mechanics of its truth, and then you master the communication of it.
That makes incredible sense as a progression. And once a student mastered those language arts of the trivium, they graduated to the quadrivium, the 4 ways, which were arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, right?
Yes. And if the trivium was about language, the quadrivium was about the mathematical structure of the universe. And again, just look at the logical progression here.
Break it down for me.
Arithmetic is the study of pure number, just the numbers themselves.
Right.
Geometry is the study of number and space shapes and architecture. Music is the study of number and time, rhythm, harmony, proportions unfolding chronologically.
Oh, wow. I never thought of music as number and time.
It's a beautiful way to see it. And finally, astronomy is the study of number in both space and time, the movement of celestial bodies across the heavens.
That is just a remarkably cohesive way to understand the universe. It's not siloed at all. Everything connects.
Everything.
And this structure, the 7-part curriculum, was the engine that powered a massive leap forward in the 11th and 12th centuries, which was the invention of the university.
Yes. The birth of the university in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford represents a tectonic shift in human history. What happened was that the guild system, the way medieval society organized trades like bakers or stonemasons, that guild system was applied directly to knowledge. Scholars and students organized themselves into guilds or universitas to protect their rights and establish standards.
Which is where we get the concept of a degree. I mean, a bachelor's degree or a master's degree wasn't originally just a piece of paper you hung on a wall to get a job at a bank.
No, it was literal guild certification. A master's degree meant you had demonstrated enough competence to be accepted as a master in the guild of teaching.
That is wild.
They created faculties law, medicine, theology, and the arts. They formalized pedagogy through structured lectures and intense formalized disputations. The entire physical and administrative structure of the modern research university is a direct descendant of those medieval innovations.
But there's a massive caveat to everything we've just discussed here.
A huge one.
Whether we are talking about Plato's philosopher kings or Roman orators or medieval scholars dissecting logic in Paris, we are talking about a microscopic fraction of the human population.
Absolutely microscopic.
Classical and medieval education was fundamentally exclusive. It was reserved for aristocrats, the wealthy, and the clergy. If you were a peasant farmer, which was, 90% of the population?
It's easily 90%.
You were not learning the quadrivium. You were farming. So the obvious question is, what break this open? How do we transition from this highly elite, exclusive system into a world where we suddenly decided that the masses needed to be educated?
Well, that transition certainly didn't happen because rulers suddenly became benevolent democrats.
No, I wouldn't expect so.
It happened because of a collision between a massive theological revolution and a disruptive communication technology. We are talking about the Protestant Reformation and the printing press.
It's fascinating that the drive for mass public education wasn't originally an economic project at all, but a deeply religious one.
Yeah.
How does Martin Luther's dispute with the Catholic Church in 1517 translate into putting millions of kids into classrooms?
It comes down to a fundamental shift in where authority resides. Before the Reformation, in medieval Catholicism, the interpretation of Scripture was mediated.
Mediated by the priests.
Exactly. The church hierarchy, the priests, and the pope held the authority. The Bible was in Latin, which the common people couldn't read anyway.
Right.
So you learned about God by looking at the stained glass windows, listening to the priest, and participating in the collective rituals. Your relationship with the divine was entirely managed by an institution.
But Luther comes along and argues for sola scriptura, by Scripture alone. He insisted that every individual Christian had the right and the absolute duty to read the Word of God for themselves, in their own language.
Yes. But as you can imagine, that theological demand creates an immediate, massive logistical crisis.
I mean, yeah.
If salvation depends on your ability to read the Bible directly, but 90% of your population is completely illiterate, you have a society full of damned souls. Luther's theological shift demanded mass literacy as a strict precondition for religious salvation.
So literacy shifts from being this luxury for the elite to an absolute existential necessity for the commoner.
As a direct result, in the early 16th century, you see the Lutheran states of northern Germany, places like Gotha and Thuringia, doing something totally unprecedented.
What did they do?
They established the very first compulsory, state-mandated elementary education systems in the Western world. They ordered parents to send their children to school because reading the Bible was quite literally a matter of eternal life or death.
But Luther's demand for mass literacy would have been totally impossible just a century earlier. Because if you wanted a book in the 14th century, a monk had to sit in a scriptorium and painstakingly copy it by hand on parchment made from animal skins.
It took months, years sometimes.
A single Bible might cost the equivalent of a small farm. You cannot have mass education when the reading material is that scarce. Which brings us to the technology, the printing press.
Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type in the mid-15th century was the infrastructural foundation for the modern mind.
It's hard to overstate how big of a deal it was.
It's impossible to overstate. By mechanizing the reproduction of texts, the printing press drove the cost of books down exponentially. It made it possible, for the very first time in human history, to flood a society with identical copies of complex information.
I always think of the printing press as the internet of the 1500s. It created this incredible new infrastructure for distributing information.
That's a great comparison.
But infrastructure alone isn't enough, right? You need a reason for people to actually adopt it. Martin Luther essentially provided the killer app for the printing press.
The killer app, yes.
He provided the urgent ideological demand that made every common person feel like they had to engage with this new technology.
A killer app is an excellent modern parallel. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the shift from oral and visual learning to printed textual learning literally rewired human cognition.
How so?
Well, reading a printed book is an isolated individual act. It requires sustained silent focus. It encourages linear sequential thinking. The mass schooling that emerged from the Reformation was essentially designed to train human brains to interface with this new printed technology.
And once the state realizes that it can mandate schooling to create good readers and good Christians, it doesn't take long for the state to realize it can use the exact same mechanism to create good, obedient citizens.
Precisely. The political power of the school becomes obvious very quickly.
But whenever an institution starts demanding conformity on that scale, you get a philosophical rebellion. If the church and the state are viewing children as basically blank slates to be written on, who was the first thinker to hit the brakes and say, wait, maybe we are approaching this completely wrong?
The most explosive challenge to that top-down model came in 1762 from the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
With his book, Émile.
Yes, Émile, or On Education. Rousseau catalyzed a complete paradigm shift because before him, the dominant tradition viewed children essentially as miniature, defective adults.
Defective adults. That's so great.
Or as vessels to be filled with adult knowledge and discipline.
So the goal of education was basically to beat the child out of the child as quickly as possible.
Exactly. But Rousseau completely inverted that logic. He proposed that childhood is not a defect. It is a distinct, vital stage of human development. He argued that human beings are born naturally good, and it is the corrupt institutions of society that make them wicked.
So for him, the worst thing you can do is force a child to passively absorb the prejudices and fixed knowledge of the adult world.
Right.
How does he actually propose teaching then? I mean, in Emile, he creates this thought experiment with a fictional student. How does Emile learn if he's not sitting at a desk memorizing a textbook?
Rousseau advocates for experiential, child-centered learning. He argues that education should follow the natural developmental trajectory of the child's own curiosities.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, for example, instead of giving Emile a lecture on the abstract concept of property rights,
Which would bore a kid to tears.
right. Instead of that, the tutor encourages Emile to plant some beans in a garden. Emile cares for the beans, he waters them, he invests his labor into them. Then the gardener comes along and tears up Emile's beans because Emile accidentally planted them on the gardener's melon patch.
Ah. So Emile experiences the outrage of having his work destroyed, but also realizes he encroached on someone else's labor.
Yes. And through that direct emotional and physical experience, Emile deeply understands the mutual social contract of property, far better than if he had memorized a legal definition.
That makes total sense.
Rousseau believed that true learning comes from interacting with the physical world, from solving immediate problems, not from submitting to textual authority.
It's a beautiful vision. The idea of letting children run in nature, learning through their own innate curiosity, building their understanding from the ground up.
It is beautiful.
But the brutal reality is that the 19th century had absolutely zero interest in Rousseau's nature walks.
None whatsoever.
Because while philosophers were dreaming in gardens, the Industrial Revolution was building machines of iron and steam. And the Industrial Revolution didn't just need factories to mass-produce textiles. It needed a new kind of social factory to mass-produce a new kind of human being.
This is where we arrive at the architectural blueprint for the schools we actually inhabit today. The compulsory mass schooling system that emerged in the mid to late 19th century. The system responsible for your 12,000 hours was explicitly designed to serve the needs of industrial capitalism and the rapidly centralizing nation-state.
Let's break this down piece by piece, because once you map the features of a normal public school directly onto an industrial factory floor, it is terrifyingly seamless.
It really is.
You can literally never unsee it. Let's start with age grading. The idea that all the 7-year-olds belong in one room and all the 8-year-olds in another. Why do we do that? It's not because a fast-learning 7-year-old wouldn't benefit from being with older kids, right?
No, we do it because that is how you batch products on an assembly line. You group the raw materials by their manufacture date, their birth year.
Wow.
It assumes a uniform, standardized progression through the system. In a factory, you can't have one piece of steel moving at a different speed than the rest. It jams the machinery. Age grading allows administrators to process massive cohorts of children efficiently, moving them from station to station, grade to grade, regardless of their individual developmental readiness or their varied interests.
It's administrative convenience overriding pedagogical reality.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the school bell and the 50-minute class period? The bell rings, you instantly drop mathematics mid-thought, you walk down a crowded hallway, the bell rings again, and you immediately pivot your brain to history.
That is a direct application of Taylorism and scientific management to the human mind. The school bell perfectly mirrors the factory whistle.
Right.
Prior to the Industrial Revolution, agricultural time was governed by the sun, the seasons, and the completion of a task. But industrial labor requires workers who are conditioned to respond to abstract, standardized mechanical time. The factory shift requires you to start and stop exactly when the machine dictates.
So the bell is quite literally Pavlovian training for shift work.
It is. It severs the natural flow of deep, immersive concentration. It teaches the child that their internal curiosity must always be subordinated to the external schedule of the institution.
And look at how we divide the knowledge itself. We teach math, science, literature, and art as completely separate subjects, in different rooms, often with teachers who never even collaborate.
That is the industrial division of labor applied to human intellect.
Like tightening a bolt.
Exactly. On a factory floor, one worker tightens a specific bolt. The next worker attaches a wire. Neither of them needs to understand the engineering of the entire engine. In the factory school, knowledge is artificially siloed.
Which is so strange when you think about it.
It is, because the student rarely gets to see the structural connection between, say, the literature of a historical period and the scientific breakthroughs occurring at the exact same time. It's compartmentalized, which makes it easier to standardize and test, but much harder to deeply understand.
And the curriculum itself is the ultimate standardized product. Every third grader in a state reads the same textbook on the same day to pass the same test at the end of the year. The goal is to output a predictable, uniform worker with a baseline of literacy and numeracy who could be slotted interchangeably into the industrial economy.
And crucially, this system heavily emphasized compliance, punctuality, and the ability to follow rote instructions from an authority figure without questioning the premise.
Because if you question the premise on a factory floor, the assembly line stops.
Precisely.
There's one massive feature of our school calendar, though, that doesn't fit the factory metaphor.
Oh.
The summer break. Because factories don't shut down for 2.5 months in July and August.
That is true. The long summer break is a fascinating historical artifact from a competing economic system. It reflects the agricultural calendar. It was a necessary political compromise during the 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when a substantial portion of the population still lived in rural areas. Older children were vital economic assets. Their labor was desperately needed on the farm during the peak growing and harvesting seasons.
This raises an incredibly important question, and I really want you, the listener, to pause and think about this in the context of your own life and your modern job. We are currently living in the digital age. We are navigating artificial intelligence, remote work, the gig economy, and just rapid technological disruption. Why on earth are we still utilizing an agricultural calendar for our breaks and an industrial factory bell system for our daily rhythm to prepare human beings for the mid-21st century?
It is a profound example of structural lag.
Structural lag.
Yes. Institutions tend to calcify. They become self-perpetuating bureaucracies that resist fundamental redesign. This structural rigidity was critiqued most forcefully by the philosopher Ivan Illich in his seminal 1971 book, Deschooling Society.
Illich is fascinating because he didn't just critique the quality of the math or history being taught. He argued that the most powerful thing schools teach has absolutely nothing to do with the official syllabus.
Right.
He called it the hidden curriculum. What exactly is the hidden curriculum?
Illich pointed out that through the very architecture and rituals of the school, the grading systems, the bells, the absolute authority of the teacher children are quietly absorbing a much deeper, more insidious lesson. The hidden curriculum teaches compliance. It teaches passivity.
It teaches you your place.
It teaches students to constantly look to a certified expert for validation of their own worth and intelligence.
So it trains you to believe that learning is something an institution does to you, rather than something you do for yourself.
Yes. The hidden curriculum instills the belief that knowledge is a scarce commodity dispensed by an authority figure, rather than something that a curious human being actively constructs through meaningful engagement with the real world.
That's powerful.
Illich equated schooling to institutional processing, which inevitably alienates the individual from their own capacity for self-directed learning.
It's a devastating critique.
Oh,
and he wasn't the only one who saw this. The factory model was incredibly efficient at producing compliant workers, but educators realized very early on that it was absolutely crushing human creativity and critical thinking. Which brings us to the counter-movement, the progressive tradition.
The progressive education movement emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a direct intellectual challenge to the mechanical, rote-learning factory model.
Okay.
If the factory school was about transmitting a fixed, static body of knowledge to passive, compliant students, the progressive model sought to organize education around the child's active participation, their developmental readiness, and their social context.
And the absolute heavyweight champion of this movement in America was John Dewey. In his 1916 masterpiece, Democracy in Education, he laid out a vision that completely rejected the factory metaphor. But to understand Dewey, we have to grasp his philosophical foundation. He was a pragmatist. What does pragmatist epistemology actually mean for a student sitting in a classroom?
It is a profound shift in how we define truth and knowledge. In traditional schooling, knowledge is viewed as a fixed photograph of reality, a set of absolute facts that exist out there in a textbook, and the student's job is to just memorize that photograph.
Right.
Pragmatism, championed by thinkers like William James and Dewey, argues that knowledge is not a static picture, it is an active tool. It is an instrument we use to solve problems and adapt to our environment.
So an idea is only true if it actually works when you apply it to a real-world problem.
Precisely. For Dewey, genuine learning only occurs when a learner is confronted with a genuine, meaningful problem, and they have to actively experiment, hypothesize, and apply knowledge to overcome that obstacle.
So instead of a teacher standing at a chalkboard saying, memorize these 5 causes of the American Revolution for the test on Friday, a Deweyan classroom might say, Our local river is polluted. Let's use chemistry to analyze the water, history to understand the zoning laws that allow the factories to be built, and language arts to write persuasive letters to the city council to fix it.
That is the exact distinction. Dewey envisioned schools not as industrial assembly lines, but as vibrant, miniature communities of democratic inquiry. He believed that a functioning democracy doesn't just need people who can read a ballot. It requires citizens who possess specific habits of mind, deep curiosity, rigorous critical thinking, and the ability to collaborate with diverse people to solve complex social problems.
And the factory school kills those habits.
The factory school kills those habits. The progressive school is designed to cultivate them.
Now, Dewey provided the incredible philosophical rhetoric, but he wasn't always the best at translating it into a replicable physical system. The person who actually built the progressive operating system, the physical, practical reality, was Maria Montessori.
Maria Montessori's story is extraordinary. She was a pioneering physician in Italy, and she began her educational work in Rome in 1907. Crucially, she developed her methods by working with children in an asylum who had severe intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Children whom the traditional rigid factory system had completely discarded as unteachable.
Yes. She observed them, and she realized that the problem wasn't the children, the problem was the environment they were trapped in.
Wow.
Her approach was intensely empirical and scientific. By carefully observing what engaged these children, she developed a pedagogy based on self-directed activity and tactile learning. When she later applied these methods to neurotypical children in the slums of Rome, the results were explosive.
I mean, if you walk into a true Montessori classroom today, it looks like a different universe compared to a traditional school. You do not see rows of desks facing a chalkboard.
No, you see a carefully prepared environment. You see mixed age groupings, often spanning 3 years, which destroys the industrial age grading batch system right there.
Right.
You see beautiful, tactile, autodidactic materials like the famous pink tower or the golden beads for math designed so the child can discover mathematical or spatial truths through physical manipulation rather than abstract lecture.
Now, what is the teacher doing if they aren't lecturing at the front of the room?
In the Montessori paradigm, the teacher's role fundamentally shifts. They are no longer the authoritative dispenser of knowledge. They become a highly trained observer and guide. Their job is to watch the child carefully and introduce the right material at the precise developmental moment the child is ready for it, and then just step back and let the child engage in uninterrupted deep concentration.
And this isn't just nice theory, right? I mean, modern cognitive research actually backs this up, particularly regarding executive function.
It does. Now, we must be scientifically careful here. There are self-selection biases in some of the data because parents who choose and can afford Montessori often provide other socioeconomic advantages to their children, making perfectly controlled comparisons difficult.
Right, that makes sense.
However, rigorously controlled studies, including lottery-based admissions studies, point to significant positive outcomes. Children in authentic Montessori environments show distinct advantages in the development of executive function.
Let's quickly define executive function because it's a huge buzzword. It's essentially the brain's air traffic control system, right?
Yes.
It encompasses working memory, the ability to switch tasks flexibly, and inhibitory control, meaning the ability to resist an impulse or delay gratification.
Exactly. And think about how a Montessori classroom builds inhibitory control organically. If a child wants to use a specific map puzzle, but another child is currently using it, there's only one map puzzle in the room. The teacher doesn't force them to share or set a timer.
Oh, that's interesting.
The first child must learn to wait, to regulate their impulse, and to choose an alternative activity until the material is available. That daily organic practice builds incredibly robust executive function, intrinsic motivation, and creative problem-solving skills.
Okay, so we connect this to the bigger picture. Here is the massive glaring disconnect. If you go to a university and walk into a college of education today, John Dewey's rhetoric has completely won the ideological war. Every teacher in training is taught to value critical thinking, child-centered learning, and differentiated instruction.
Yes, that is the standard curriculum.
And we have decades of data showing Montessori's benefits for executive function. Yet the actual physical public schools we send 90% of our kids to still operate with 50-minute bells, age-graded silos, and rows of desks.
I have to push back here. If we know this progressive model works better for human development, why is it still relegated to expensive private schools or niche charter programs? Why isn't it the default public system?
That is the structural paradox of modern education. The progressive model requires highly trained educators who possess the professional autonomy to make real-time decisions about individual students.
Okay.
It requires flexibility, deep trust, and high tolerance for messy, non-standardized, highly individualized outcomes.
Which is a bureaucratic nightmare to manage at a state level. Precisely. The political machinery of mass, state-run schooling demands the exact opposite. Politicians and bureaucracies demand cheap scalability, predictable testing metrics, standardized accountability, and data that can be easily compared across districts. The progressive vision won the hearts and minds of the theorists, but the industrial factory vision maintained a stranglehold on the budget, the legislation, and the bureaucracy.
It is much easier to manage a factory than a garden.
Well said.
It is deeply frustrating. We know what a better, more human system looks like, but we seem politically and administratively incapable of building it at scale in places like the US or the UK. But to be fair, that's not true everywhere. To see what happens when a country actually tries to restructure its default public system away from the factory model, we have to look overseas.
If we want to move past philosophical theory and look at what actually functions at a national scale today, we have to examine the PISA study. PISA stands for the Program for International Student Assessment, conducted by the OECD.
It's basically the World Cup of educational policy.
Essentially, yes. Since the year 2000, every 3 years, they administer standardized tests in mathematics, reading, and science to hundreds of thousands of 15-year-olds across more than 70 different countries.
Wow.
It has provided the most massive, internationally comparative evidence base in the history of education.
And importantly, PISA isn't just asking kids to regurgitate memorized facts, right? It is designed to test applied knowledge, like, can a 15-year-old use their math skills to solve a real-world logistical problem? And naturally, every politician in the world obsesses over the rankings. Who is at the top?
There are several consistently high-performing jurisdictions, places like Japan, South Korea, Estonia, Canada, Singapore, and Finland. But the contrast between Finland and Singapore provides the most profound lessons, because these two nations achieve their world-class results using diametrically opposite cultural and pedagogical philosophies.
Let's start with Finland. Because the Finnish miracle became this massive phenomenon. Everyone wanted to know how they were dominating the reading and science scores. And their design principles are entirely counterintuitive if you are used to the high-stakes testing model.
Finland is fascinating because in the 1970s, their education system was actually highly mediocre.
Really?
Yes. Their rise to the top was the result of a deliberate, sustained, decades-long restructuring based on equity and trust. First and foremost, they have virtually no mandatory high-stakes standardized testing until the very end of secondary school.
Wait, so schools aren't spending 3 months a year doing test prep to hit an arbitrary state metric?
No. Children are assessed by their teachers, but those assessments aren't used to rank schools or penalize districts. Second, they drastically elevated the teaching profession. Every single teacher in Finland is required to hold a master's degree, which is heavily subsidized by the state.
Okay, that's a huge difference.
Admission into teacher training programs is incredibly rigorous and selective. It is a profession as respected as medicine or law.
So their strategy is to invest incredibly heavily in the quality and the training of the human being standing at the front of the room. And then here's the crazy part. They actually trust them to do their job.
Exactly. They emphasize intense professional autonomy. There are no centralized school inspectors breathing down a teacher's neck. And surprisingly, they spend relatively little on formal schooling compared to high spenders like the United States.
And the results?
Top international rankings in measured achievement. But more importantly for the Finns, they achieve extraordinarily high equity. There is very little variation in performance between schools. A child from a lower income background gets virtually the exact same high-quality education as a child from a wealthy background.
That's incredible.
And perhaps most crucially, they consistently report very high levels of student well-being, low anxiety, and high life satisfaction.
Okay, so that's the Finnish model. High trust, immense autonomy, low stress, high equity. Now let's fly across the globe to Singapore. They are also consistently at the very top of the PISA rankings. Do they use the Finnish model of relaxed trust?
They use a model that operates on almost the exact opposite set of principles.
Oh boy.
The Singaporean system is highly centralized, highly directive, and defined by high-stakes streaming at a young age. Children are sorted into different academic tracks based on intense examination performance early in their educational careers.
That sounds like an immense amount of pressure for a 12-year-old.
It is a staggering amount of pressure. There is a deeply ingrained cultural emphasis on academic achievement, supported by a massive shadow education industry.
Shadow education.
Yes, a huge percentage of Singaporean students attend private tutoring centers after their regular school hours just to prepare for these pivotal exams. The pedagogical culture inside the classroom tends to be much more traditional, rigorous, and directive than the holistic Finnish approach.
But you can't argue with their math scores. I mean, they absolutely crush the PISA test.
They produce undeniably impressive international academic rankings. However, the data also shows the collateral effects. This approach comes with lower equity. The gap between the highest performers and the lowest performers is wider, and significantly lower metrics for student well-being. Students report much higher levels of school-related anxiety and fear of failure.
So the lesson here is incredibly complex. It's like trying to build a world-class Olympic athlete.
How so?
Well, you can do it the Finnish way.
Yeah.
Focusing on high trust, holistic wellness, letting the athlete develop intrinsic motivation at their own pace with expert autonomous coaching. Or you can do it the Singaporean way, a grueling, high-pressure, intensely competitive boot camp.
Oh.
Both methods might successfully get your athlete to the gold medal podium for their event. But the athletes are going to feel fundamentally different about themselves and their lives at the finish line.
That is a highly perceptive analogy. The central lesson of international comparisons is that multiple differing models can produce high measured achievement. But we have to recognize that measured achievement on a standardized math test is not the totality of what an education system does to a human being or to the fabric of a society.
And regardless of whether a student survives the Holistic Wellness Center of Finland or the intense academic boot camp of Singapore, both of those systems are ultimately funneling their most successful students toward the exact same modern finish line.
Higher education.
The university. But here is the massive problem. The university system today, particularly in the West, is facing an existential crisis of purpose and economics.
It is a multifaceted crisis, and to understand it, we really have to look at the sheer scale of its historical expansion.
Right.
From the post-WWII era in the 1960s onward, higher education in most developed countries underwent a radical structural transformation. It shifted from being a relatively elite system, educating perhaps 5 to 10% of the population for specific professions.
Right, like doctors and lawyers.
Exactly. It shifted from that to a mass system expected to process 40, 50, or even 60% of all high school graduates.
Why did everyone suddenly decide that half the population needed a 4-year college degree?
The primary driver was, and still is, economic. The entire massive expansion of the university system is fueled by the graduate wage premium. In the United States, for example, individuals who hold a bachelor's degree earn, on average, approximately 65 to 70% higher lifetime earnings compared to those whose formal education stopped at a high school diploma.
65 to 70% more money over a lifetime. That is a massive life-altering incentive. Of course, everyone wants to go.
Exactly.
But here is where the debate gets incredibly fierce among economists, and it strikes at the very heart of what school actually is. Why exactly does that piece of paper make you earn more money? Is it because the university actually taught you valuable concrete skills that make you a objectively better, more productive worker?
Well, that is the traditional mainstream economic view known as human capital theory. The idea is that you go to college, you sit in a lecture hall, you learn advanced accounting or structural engineering or rigorous critical thinking, and those actual literal skills increase your intrinsic productive capacity.
Okay.
Employers are willing to pay you a premium because you are bringing enhanced human capital to their firm.
Okay, that's the optimistic view. But there's another theory, and it is way more cynical, but honestly, it feels incredibly accurate to anyone who has sat through a useless seminar, the signaling theory. Let's talk about the economist Brian Kaplan. In 2018, he wrote a highly controversial book called The Case Against Education. What is his core argument?
Kaplan's argument is highly provocative and strikes at the legitimacy of the entire higher education industry. He suggests that the vast majority of the college wage premium has absolutely nothing to do with human capital. He argues it is almost entirely about signaling.
I want to try a thought experiment I've heard regarding Kaplan's theory to see if I understand the mechanism.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you have two choices. Choice A. You go to Harvard for 4 years. You attend every single class. You learn all the material. You gain all the brilliant human capital. But on graduation day, Harvard refuses to give you a diploma, and you are never allowed to tell an employer you attended.
Okay.
Choice B. You never attend a single class at Harvard. You learn absolutely nothing. You sleep for 4 years. But due to a clerical error, Harvard mails you an official, verified diploma with your name on it. Which person gets the high-paying consulting job at McKinsey?
Kaplan would argue without hesitation that choice B gets the job, and that thought experiment perfectly isolates the mechanism of signaling. According to this theory, the actual content of what you learn in college, the sociology lectures on 19th century literature, the intramural sports, the essays you forgot the moment you submitted them, is largely irrelevant to your future employer.
What the degree actually does is serve as a brutally effective, highly expensive credentialing filter.
Yes. It proves to an employer that you possess 3 highly valued innate traits. First, you are reasonably intelligent enough to pass the exams. Second, you are compliant enough to jump through bureaucratic hoops for 4 years without rebelling. And third, you are conscientious enough to show up on time and do the required work.
So the degree doesn't build those traits.
Yeah.
It simply certifies that you already had them.
Exactly. It's a stamp on your forehead that says, I'm in the upper echelon of the talent distribution, hire me.
This raises an incredibly important question, and I want you, the listener, to really think about this in the context of your own life or your children's lives. If Kaplan is right about signaling, and let's be clear, this is a fiercely debated economic theory, not absolute established fact, but if signaling is the primary driver of the wage premium, are millions of young people essentially taking out massive life-altering mortgages just to buy a VIP badge for their resume? Are we forcing people into a 4-year, $100,000 arms race just to prove they are employable?
It is a deeply unsettling possibility to consider, and it becomes catastrophic when we look at the financial reality of how this system is funded.
Oh, the debt.
Yes. The arms race for credentials has allowed universities to continuously raise their prices because students feel they have no choice but to pay for the signal. Since 1980, the real cost of tuition at American universities has roughly tripled, adjusting for inflation.
Tripled, while wages for the middle class have largely stagnated or grown at a fraction of that pace.
This dynamic has produced a staggering systemic debt crisis. There is currently around $1.75 trillion in outstanding student debt in the United States alone.
$1.5 trillion.
Burdening roughly 45 million Americans.
45 million people carrying $1.5 trillion of debt before they even buy a house or start a family. That is not just a financial problem, that is a societal failure.
It has fundamentally transformed the nature of higher education. For decades, a university degree was viewed as a safe, guaranteed escalator to the middle class. Today, it operates much more like a high-risk financial instrument.
With incredibly variable returns.
Exactly.
But because if you take out $80,000 in debt to get a degree in computer science or electrical engineering from a top-tier school, your return on investment is probably going to be astronomical. You'll pay that off quickly.
Yeah.
But if you are pressured into taking out that exact same $80,000 to get a degree in a highly oversaturated field from a mid-tier or lower-tier school,
you might end up working as a barista while trapped in a financial nightmare for the rest of your adult life.
this financial reality has fractured the social contract of education. There's a widespread, palpable sense among young adults today that a fundamental societal promise has been broken.
It really has.
They were told their entire lives by parents, teachers, and guidance counselors, do your homework, get good grades, go to college regardless of the cost, and you will be economically secure. They held up their end of the bargain. But the system delivered millions of them into precarious labor markets, saddled with non-dischargeable debt.
The resentment is real, and it's justified. We've built an entire global economy around this obsession with standardized assessment, institutional certification, and expensive economic signaling.
But I want to shift gears for our final section, because this massive institutional machine didn't just shape our bank accounts and our career paths. It literally shaped the very words coming out of our mouths right now. Let's talk about education and the English language.
This is one of the most fascinating and often overlooked intersections of history. The history of formal mass education is inextricably entangled with the history of the English language, particularly how it was standardized during the 18th and 19th centuries.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand this. Schools didn't invent modern English, obviously.
Yeah.
But how did the creation of mass schooling fundamentally alter the language?
As mass schooling systems began to expand, state bureaucracies faced a massive logistical problem.
Which was,
How do you assess millions of students efficiently? You need uniform standards. If a student in London and a student in Yorkshire are taking an exam, you need a way for an examiner to mark a test right or wrong based on a single unified metric.
right.
This institutional need for accessible uniformity drove the creation of a massive prescriptive grammar tradition.
Meaning they needed rule books.
Precisely. It fueled the booming dictionary industry in the 18th century, spearheaded by figures like Samuel Johnson, and eventually the vast examination systems that enforced a single, rigid standard of correctness. The institution needed a standardized language to make standardized grading possible.
So when my high school English teacher circled something in red ink and told me I couldn't end a sentence with a preposition, she wasn't handing down some ancient law of linguistic nature. She was enforcing a standard that was largely created to fulfill the grading requirements of a 19th century bureaucracy.
That is exactly what was happening. And this is vital to understand from a linguistic perspective. School English, the standard, correct academic English taught in classrooms, is not inherently more linguistically sophisticated than any other variety of English.
It's not.
No, it is not more internally consistent, it is not mathematically more logical, and it is not better at conveying complex thought.
Then why did it become the standard? Why did that specific version of English get to write the rule book?
Because it was the version of the language spoken by the people who already held political and economic power. It was the dialect of the London elite, the aristocracy, and the emerging professional classes.
Oh.
It was politically appropriate for an educational system designed to serve specific state goals: social cohesion, professional certification, and particularly in Britain, the administration of a global empire.
Yeah.
As the old linguistic adage goes, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy behind it.
And an education department. But this creates massive real-world friction because there is a huge tension between this educated school standard and the full, vibrant diversity of English as it is actually spoken in homes and communities around the world.
Yes, there is.
I'm talking about vernacular dialects, things like African American English in the U.S., regional British dialects like Geordie or Scouse or Caribbean Creoles.
From a strictly objective scientific linguistic perspective, these vernacular dialects are every bit as grammatically complex, equally expressive, and equally systematic as standard English.
They have real rules.
They have their own strict internal rules regarding tense, syntax, and phonology. But in educational settings, because they deviate from the school-taught standard, they are systematically marked as incorrect, broken, or uneducated.
And the way schools have historically treated students who speak these dialects is pretty dark. It wasn't just, oh, let's learn a different way to say this.
The history is indeed fraught and often brutal. For a long time, the primary institutional approach was systematic suppression. Students were actively and sometimes physically punished for speaking their home variety of English in the classroom or on the playground.
The explicit goal was eradication.
Exactly. Erase the home identity to install the institutional identity. Later, as pedagogical theories evolved, the approach shifted to what we might call benign neglect.
Meaning they stopped hitting kids with rulers.
Right. The teacher wouldn't necessarily punish the student with a ruler, but the home variety was simply ignored, deemed entirely inappropriate for academic work, while the standard was quietly enforced as the only valid mode of expression for a smart person.
And today, are we doing any better? Because a child shouldn't have to feel like their mother's voice is wrong.
In many places, progressive educators and linguists are moving toward genuinely additive bilingual or dialectal approaches.
Additive, meaning you add a tool to the toolbox without throwing the old one away.
The goal of an additive approach is to help students develop complete fluency and competence in standard English, which we must acknowledge remains absolutely essential for accessing traditional economic opportunities and political power.
Sure.
But without requiring them to abandon, suppress, or feel ashamed of their home variety. It recognizes the scientific validity and immense cultural value of both. You learn the code of the boardroom, but you keep the code of your community.
It really makes you rethink every time you've reflexively corrected someone's grammar or silently judged them for how they speak in a meeting. I want you to ask yourself, are you actually correcting a lapse in logic? Or are you just unconsciously acting as a volunteer enforcement agent for a 19th century exam standard?
It is a deeply humbling realization. When we study the history of education and language, we are forced to confront how many of our unquestioned assumptions about intelligence, worth, and correctness are actually just institutional constructs passed down through those 12,000 hours.
And that brings us full circle. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, pulling back the curtain on the walls of that third grade classroom.
We really have.
We started in the sunlit groves of ancient Greece, with Plato dreaming up an elite academy to sort society into rigid castes, based on the tripartite soul. We watched the medieval universities invent the degree.
And we saw Martin Luther use the printing press to ignite a revolution of mass literacy just so people could read the Bible for themselves.
We saw how the Industrial Revolution took that mass literacy and packed it into a factory model, organizing children by their manufacture date, ringing bells to simulate shift work, and building a hidden curriculum of compliance that Ivan Illich warned us about.
We explored the progressive pushback of John Dewey and Maria Montessori, proving that there are better ways to nurture human potential and executive function, even if our bureaucracies refuse to adopt them at scale because it's too hard to test.
We crossed the globe to see how Finland uses high trust and professional autonomy to achieve what Singapore achieves through high-stakes streaming and immense adolescent stress.
We waded into the trillion-dollar swamp of modern student debt, debating whether a university degree is an actual transfer of human capital or just an incredibly expensive VIP signaling badge that proves you can jump through hoops.
And finally, we looked at how this entire massive system even dictates the very rules of the words we use to describe it all.
It is a complex, beautiful, and deeply flawed architecture that we have built. Education is our highest human aspiration, but schooling is a distinctly human institution, bearing all the marks of our historical compromises, our economic needs, and our political battles.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought, a thought experiment for you to mull over.
Okay.
Imagine, for a moment, that you had a magic wand. If you could wave it and completely erase the 12,000 hours of schooling as we know it today, erase the factory bells, erase the ancient classical hierarchies, burn the 19th century agricultural calendars, and the prescriptive grading rubrics.
A completely blank slate.
Yes, a completely blank slate. If you were tasked to design an educational system from scratch, specifically tailored for the unprecedented challenges of tomorrow, the age of artificial intelligence, global interconnectedness, and rapid economic change, what would your school look like? How would you build it?
It is the most vital question we can ask because the architects of the future are currently sitting in the classrooms of the past.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking closely at the things you've always taken for granted, and we will catch you next time.